Great. Okay. I'm going to introduce them both now, and then they're going to take the stage. Paisley Rekdal's newest work of nonfiction is Appropriate, a Provocation, which examines cultural appropriation, and it was published this year by Norton. She's the author of a book of essays, The Night My Mother Met Bruce Lee, the hybrid photo text memoir, Intimate, and 5 books of poetry, including Animal Eye, a finalist for the 2013 Kingsley Tufts Prize and winner of the UNT Rilke Prize, Imaginary Vessels, a finalist for the 2018 Kingsley Tufts Prize and the Washington State Book Award, and her newest poetry collection, Nightingale, a retelling of Ovid's Metamorphoses. Her book-length essay, The Broken Country on Trauma, a Crime, and the Continuing Legacy of Vietnam, was published by University of Georgia Press in 2017. She was the guest editor for Best American Poetry 2020. Her work has received many fellowships and awards, including the Guggenheim, the Amy Lowell Poetry Traveling Fellowship, a Fulbright, a Civitella Ranieri Residency, a National Endowment for the Arts Fellowship, and 2 Pushcart Prizes. She is a distinguished professor at the University of Utah, where she is also the creator and editor of the community web projects Mapping Literary Utah and Mapping Salt Lake City. In May 2017, she was named Utah's Poet Laureate and received a 2019 Academy of American Poets Laureate Fellowship. Carol Edgarian is an award-winning novelist, essayist, teacher, and editor. Her novels include the newly released Vera, the New York Times bestseller, 3 Stages of Amazement, and the international bestseller, Rise the Euphrates, hailed by the Washington Post as a book whose generosity of spirit, intelligence, humanity, and ambition are what literature ought to be and rarely is today. It was awarded the ANC Freedom Prize, and a 20th anniversary revised edition of the novel was released to mark the centennial of the Armenian genocide. Her articles and essays have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, NPR, and W, among many other places. She co-edited The Writer's Life, Intimate Thoughts on Work, Love, Inspiration, and Fame from the Diaries of the World's Great Writers. She's a frequent speaker at conferences and schools. And with her husband, she founded the nonprofit Narrative, a leading digital publisher of fiction, poetry, essays, and art. Please help me welcome Carol and Paisley.
Hi, everybody.
Hello. So should I go first, Carol? I'll just show the poem.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, I'm going to do that annoying thing. I'm going to share my screen if I can do that. Let me see. I don't see. Oh, there we go. Okay. Let me see. Only host all participants. So it says advanced sharing options. I'm on there. So all participants, how do I? Why am I doing this? Oh, there we go. Okay. There's always that flurry of terror. Okay, so what I wanted to do is talk a little bit about appropriation actually through a digital poem that I've created for the Transcontinental Railroad. I was asked to do this as Utah's Poet Laureate. And one of the other reasons I want to talk about it is Vera is, of course, set at the turn of the 20th century in California, in San Francisco. And it takes on tons of topics, but one of them is also Chinese and immigration. And interestingly, West, a translation. When I was asked to write a poem about the Transcontinental, I'm half Chinese. I was extremely excited to do this. I wanted to think about translating 19th century history, especially something as enormous as the railroad, through other languages and other cultures. And I started with a poem that was carved on Angel Island's walls. And this was carved by an anonymous Chinese writer who was detained, and it elegizes another Chinese detainee who committed suicide during his or her detention. And so I take the Chinese poem and each character will open up into a poem about the cultural impact of the railroad. And I'm just going to show you how it works. All of this is information in the about section and there's instructions, but I'll just play it for you. And so I actually will be playing some of the videos and I'm going to ask you what you want to learn about from the 19th century. So I'll call it out.
Has twee tot at penanita.
聽到火車嘅聲音，
Δεν είμαστε επιβάτες στο τρένο εμείς.
指摘が聞こえてくる。それは私たちの重荷となり、今までの計り知れない人々の発生、涙、苦難を乗せてくる。
This is the sound of a train.
No viajamos en el tren. Αυτός είναι ο ήχος ενός τρένου.
Non riusciamo a guardare tutti.
聽到火車嘅聲音。
噩耗傳聞實可哀，吊君何日果思回？無能冥目憑誰訴？有失應知悔此來。千古含愁千古恨，思鄉空對望鄉台。未酬壯志迷壤土，知以雄心死不悔。
And from here you go to the poem itself. And like I said, each one of these things opens up into a story about the railroad or an appropriated voice, a document, an imagined voice, something like that. And some of you might be actually wondering why I wanted to start with Chinese. Obviously, 90% of the Central Pacific workforce from, Leland Stanford's train or company, 90% of their workforce was Chinese. I think a lot of people know that the Chinese worked on the railroad, but they don't know exactly how much. And I also wanted to start with that iconic photo of A.J. Russell's meeting of the East and West shaking hands and show you or have you listen to all of the people who are not represented in that photograph. So I'm going to play one video, and then I'm just going to throw out like some topics that maybe you want to learn about. So this is how it works. You can go in any direction you want. You can go straight ahead. You can just sort of bop around. But this is the first video.
Sorrowful news. Sorrowful news, sings the telegram. And Lincoln's body slides from DC to Springfield, his infant son, Willie, boxed beside him. Buffalo, Cleveland, Painesville, Ashtabula, 2 coffins, 1,700 miles, 14 days on 14 railroads. One day, a great line will unite us, the president promised. Father and son displayed capital after capital, Louisville, New Albany, Baltimore, Chicago. The black trains beach upon a tide of roses. Can you believe still in the promise of this union? I saw, General Dodge wrote, a little Negro drop on his knees and offer prayers, while above, the dark news thrums on wires, gone, 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 across poles tall as the ones from which the president ordered 38 Sioux to be hung.
Okay, so going back to the poem, what do you want to listen to? Do you want to know about Chinese immigration, Chinese death rituals, the Irish, African-American porters, polygamy? Would you like to know about prostitution? Would you like to know about mass murder, genocide, Hollywood, environmental destruction, the Civil War? What would you like to hear about? You can put it in the chat. Considering prostitution is one of the major themes that shows up in Vera. We might want to go to prostitution, but hey, it's up to you. Any guess? Okay, we got somebody in the chat immediately. Okay, thank you. Prostitution. Okay, and Chinese death rituals. All righty, here we go to prostitution. Where did I put it? There it is.
Hold sorrow. Imagine a farm, a famine. Your mother promised you'll learn tailoring. Imagine your father pocketing $600. Now here's the boat, its black planks wet with fog. Here is the room holding a bed, no mirror, your wash basin. You have one window wired to face the street. He will keep his pants on, his greasy shirt, his shoes. Imagine the quarter pressed after into your palm. Your street will be named for presidents you never heard of, the city's lights like strings of blood in puddles. Imagine, if you could, you'd carve your father's name on a knife tip. At night, only the train cries. Your door locks from the outside.
So in Vera, I know that Carol wrote about some of the cribs. And so I was really kind of sort of excited, but that's some of those pictures are of the cribs where the poorest prostitutes would be serving men. And a lot of them were from China. Unfortunately, I can go into more of that. Chinese death rituals. I will play two things and then I will kind of throw it to Carol. We can have a conversation, but I will show you some of the appropriated documents too. The other thing that's important to think about is the Chinese that first came to this country did not plan to stay. Most of them planned to basically take advantage of the economic opportunities they got here and then go back to China and, support their families that way. But many of them decided to stay or could not go back for whatever reason. But many of them were also very afraid of dying in America. So they would hire a huiguan, which was a sort of a death, a death association. It's hard to describe what it is, but basically they would bury you and a few months later they would disinter you, cut up the bones, put you in boxes and then ship you back. There were thousands of boxes that were sent to Tunghua Hospital in Hong Kong, and several of them, well, several hundred, have still never been collected by their relatives. But the idea was that their bodies would not stay on foreign shores. And a lot of the poems actually use appropriated documents, and this is one of them.
Body. A carload passed last night, their bones returned in barrels marked pickles. Thick as bees, ants, locusts, celestials lay siege to nature in her strongest citadel. Their genius is imitation. Show them once to do a thing and their education is complete. Wherever you put them, you'll find them good. They can withstand freezing, hunger, thirst, and heat. Their simple, narrow, but not dull minds running in old grooves. Congealed quantities, crystals of social substance. Unicated as boys or sodomites, they breed defunct in the heat of germs. They can be shipped to shore in great quantities. Even their clothes come, identical, studded with rivets.
And I'm going to show you one last thing. I'm just to show you how some of the voices that I use in this are also appropriated. So I went to oral history archives, and what I'm doing here, there's a bunch of different types of work that fall under the term appropriation. And the worst form is a cultural appropriation. I can talk about that later. But what I'm doing here is a form of redirected language, which is that I take sources, primary sources, and will sometimes either erase or cut them back, pare them back to sort of show the essence of what they're talking about. With the archives of African-American porters, for example, I wanted to think about how to preserve their specific voices, the rhythms of their speech, at the same time also sort of get to the meat of their story. So here, I'll just read a couple of stories and then I'll pause and hand this off to Carol so we can have a conversation. She can do a reading. So this is part of a character called that translates to you. And one of the things that's important to know is that these are all different voices. But so each poem is a particular speaker. Some of the outstanding citizens in Memphis was the Pullman Porters. Back in 43, one outstanding undertaker in Memphis had an accident with an old white guy. The white guy ran into him in his Cadillac, and the cops started whipping this man, saying, "Boy, what are you doing running into this man's car?" And the white guy said, "It was my fault, but the cops just kept beating him." So I said, "An outstanding citizen like that in Memphis, what is there for me?" From what I'd seen and heard from my grandmother, which raised me, incidentally, she was 8 when the Civil War started, I had a very good moral background. She taught me, don't get out there and antagonize white people. You got that fear into you, you travel. And I'll just do one last one here, and I'll play the translation. I just realized this is one of my favorite ones. So I say to them, I'm a railroad man. Why can't I stay down at this $10 million YMCA they built on 44th Street? Well, they said, we ain't never had men like you up here, but I don't give a damn. This is a YMCA put up just for railroad people. I'm as good as an engineer. I'm as good as a brakeman. I'm as good as a conductor. I'm as good as the president even of the railroad. So I picked up the fight and I won that fight hands down. Oh, I had to get real radical. And you know, from that night on, I broke in there. Black railroad workers stay with comfort. They have a library, pool hall, game room. They have a cafeteria. When you open the door, that bed is spotless. I broke the same thing down in New Haven. It wasn't tough because I'd cracked New York. That's why my wife tells me, Chico, if you had stayed on the railroad, they would have killed you. And I'll play the translation and you'll sort of know how it all ends.
We cannot count all the dead.
This is the sound of a train.
Δεν είμαστε επιβάτες στο τρένο εμείς.
Στέκειが聞こえてくる。それは私たちの重荷となり、今までの計り知れない人々の汗、
Αυτός είναι ο ήχος ενός τρένου.
聽到火車嘅聲音，
And I'll stop there. Okay,
Oh, so beautiful, Yo.
thank you.
Thank you. I mean, I think we should spend the rest of the time just talking about that, my friend. Oh, wow. Wonderful. And so powerful how you bring your voice and give those who have not been allowed to speak to the fore. I mean, that's what we try to do, right? Amazing work. And amazing how you brought history up to date and back and forward. Incredible. So I have a lot of questions. Why don't I bring Vera in and then let's go back and forth. How does that sound? Is that good? Okay.
Sounds great to me.
So knowing that, hi everyone, and knowing that Paisley was going to gift us with this new stuff she's working on, I thought I'd read a section of Vera that I've never read before. That's sort of in the middle of the book. And what comes to mind, let me give you a little background on this novel, Vera. So it takes place in 1906 in San Francisco. San Francisco being a time when a murderous town, a town just on the cusp of becoming civilized. A moment, April 1906, when the mayor of the town was going to be indicted on the morning of April 18th for corruption. And instead he got the great earthquake. And in the novel, the main character of the novel is this girl, Vera. She's 15, she's whip smart, she's contrary. She is the daughter of the most successful madam in town, a woman named Rose. But she's not being raised by Rose. She's being raised by a foster mother, a Swede with both a gambling debts and a drinking problem, and named Maury, and her daughter Pi. And so Vera spends her early days straddled, apart from her mother, aware of this underbelly of the city of prostitution and exchange. Rose is very powerful in the city. The madams at the time were some of the best business people in town. They were revered, in fact, and they knew everybody's secrets. So they were incredibly powerful. So she's aware that her mother has all this power, but she is not allowed to be near her. She only sees her 3 times a year. And there are characters who are real historical characters, but there's also this whole fictional world. And one of the main characters in the book is this butler of Rose's named Tan. And he is an accomplished cook. He is her major domo. He runs her house. He used to help run the brothel. But he's also a Chinese servant in 1906. So despite being probably one of the most refined people we meet in the novel, he must live in a basement on a dirt floor with cast off furniture and no heat. And quickly in the beginning of the book, Vera and Tan establish themselves as rivals. Tan is bugged by having to care for this other house and this other life, and he's a man of dignity, and the whole arrangement rubs him wrong. Vera pushes against him. She is smart, and she wants Rose, and so there's this rivalry. The earthquake happens, and as we're seeing today in Haiti, and I couldn't help thinking today of the society in Afghanistan, that in a moment, all of society can collapse, that what you think is the given of your life is over. And those who survive have to not only find the basics of food and shelter, they also have to find perhaps new alliances. And in the collapse of a society, there is a moment when those who are marginalized, and one could argue that if you weren't a white man in 1906, you were pretty much marginalized. Certainly if you were a girl who didn't live in the expected mode, and if you were a Chinese man who wanted more, you were up against, you were boxed. So this moment that I'm going to read about, I'm trying to think what else you need to know. Well, there was the quake, and then what isn't often talked about is the city combusted in fire. And for 4 days, San Francisco burned. Ultimately, 500 city blocks burned, 28,000 buildings reduced to ash. And quickly, Chinatown was ignited. All the brothels burned, and as the fire moved westward, Chinatown was incinerated. And what did the authorities do in that moment? Well, they rounded up all the Chinese and put them in an encampment in the Presidio, guarded by soldiers, ghettoized essentially, and not allowed to leave. So immediately after the quake, Vera gets her sister Pi up the hill to Rose's house, where they're not allowed to go, hoping that Rose is there. Their house, it burns, everything's gone, but Rose isn't there. And the house is beat up, but it's still standing. And so they become squatters, awaiting Rose, awaiting, is she wounded? Is she dead? Tan also shows up with his family, his father and his daughter, also squatters. They don't want to go to the Presidio and be trapped. So quickly they start to build an alliance, because they're the only two who really have the capability of getting through this moment and taking care of everybody ultimately they have to take care of. And Tan sets up a curbside kitchen, and he starts selling food to make money for them to repair the house, and hopefully when Rose shows up, to have something to prove their worth. So I think that's all I need to tell you in this moment. But you know why I chose this moment, I hope will become apparent. But what I try to do in story, what I think Paisley and I are doing there's the news of the day that tells you the who, what, where, and when. And in story, we get to see the how and why. We get to see the connections. And this is a moment when Vera and Tan see each other. It's a moment, and it's a moment when new possibilities open up. Despite all the prejudice, despite all the reasons not to trust one another. The end of the fire. There were thieves everywhere. Thieves pillaging the ruins of the grand houses, thieves stealing from the refugees in the park. Tan, Lo Na, and Lafang. Lo Na is Tan's father, Lafang is his daughter, guarded their curbside kingdom. As evening came on, they hauled their foodstuffs, pans, and firewood, everything short of the stove itself, into the house. Tan lifted the iron lid off of each burner and brought them in too, lest folks take them to cook over their fires in the camps. Cups, tin, kindling, soiled cotton, everything came inside. After dark, boys and girls from the camps across the street is Lafayette Square, where refugees have set up tents, and it's an encampment. Boys and girls from the camps were sent out to scavenge. They plucked horse hooey from the road for their families to use as fuel and whatever else of value they could find. The evening was also the time when Tan and I did our reckoning. Tan, whose genius lay in exotic sauces, threw together a Cantonese version of Boston baked beans. The recipe would prove our salvation for now. People went mad for it. I perched at the top of the stairs with my back against Rose's front door and waited for him. It was the first time I'd stopped all day, and a bruised weariness sat heavy in my bones. So far, I'd reconciled the mess in Rose's room and some of the rooms on the main floor. I'd taken stock of the larder, what we had and didn't have by way of food, water. I had put aside what money I found in spilled drawers, but there was too much broken inside and out, and too much I didn't know. As long as I worked, I kept my worry at a distance, but sitting on those steps brought it on. I wondered if it was true. I thought of Maury, her death, a heavy, sharp stone lodged under my ribs. I wondered if it was true that a soul hovered 3 days on earth before moving on. And if so, it had been 3 days, though it seemed a good deal longer. Part of me was still a child with a child's sense of time, mostly lived in the present, or had been before the quake. Now I was counting the hours by how many rooms needed fixing, how much food and water we had, with the only clock that mattered being the unyielding fire advancing toward us, house by obliterated house. I was tired and thirsty, my hair, clothes, even my skin had thickened with smoke. My burning eyes continuously seeped tears. Hugging my knees as I waited for Tan, I looked across Lafayette Square and wondered when the fire was going to reach us. And if the fire reached the house and beyond to the ocean, were we all going to die? I didn't want to die, that's for sure. And it occurred to me that for all her sorrows, my sister Pi was lucky to have been kissed before the world ended, even if it was by a noodle, James. I decided I wasn't about to die, yet I wasn't likely ever to be kissed, and I wiped my tears with the heel of my hand. Tan came up the steps with my supper. In those first days, we ate, if we were lucky, one meal. Tan served me as he served himself from a bowl, though instead of chopsticks, he brought me a fork. If Maury could have seen me shoveling my food, well, I ate like the beggar I always felt myself to be, all the while sneaking glances over the rim of my bowl at Tan's unreadable face, and beyond him at the tents on the hill and the smoke-filled sky above. There was no denying it, Tan's food was sublime. And when I'd finished, he took the bowl from me and handed over his silk purse stuffed with pennies and dimes. "What's not here?" I asked. He repeated the show of turning out his pockets on his silk pants. A few coins tumbled to the ground, his humble share. On a whim, I asked to see his hat, the fez that never left the top of his head. He crossed his arms and evinced his most sour face for my benefit. I didn't react. I hadn't thought about what the hat meant till the words left from my mouth, and having asked for it, I held still. Tan removed the fez with great sorrow, as if I were shaming us both by asking him to do such a dishonorable thing. His black hair beneath it was greasy, parted down the middle. He handed the fez to me and turned his back. Inside the crown, he'd sewn a pouch. I felt with my fingers the coins, warmed by his head and tightly packed. All day, he'd been wearing the stolen money on his bean. When I tugged on the thin silk string knotted at the pouch's throat, coins splashed into the bowl of my skirt. So many pennies and dimes, at least a third of the take. "Damn you," I said. He pretended not to hear me, though he couldn't hide the shiver that passed through his bones. For the first time since the quake, I was afraid. I had no idea what role I should play in this game with Tan, but it seemed that whomever I chose to be, I would be forever. I gathered the part of my skirt with the coins in my fist and slowly, unsteadily climbed to my feet. I carried the whole lot, hat, money, my fear, up to my attic room, and there I stayed. I was trying all night to think of how to punish Tan. Did I have to punish him? I considered the welts on Tan's back. Tan had been beaten when when the quake first happened. And I thought of my own with the dread boar bristle brush, and I knew that that would never be my way. But I didn't know what my way was. I didn't want to be Tan's boss, and the world was burning, and I was afraid. I decided to count the money. Tan and I were alike in that we trusted money and believed in its power, believed it was something worth desiring, akin to love. Money, I thought I understood, as Tan understood it. But that girl I'd been just a few days ago with her childish wants and beliefs had abandoned me. She was as scarce as what money used to buy, houses and hats and chickens and wine. I trusted there were answers in those pennies and nickels, a world entire, if only I could find it. The take for one day in Tan's kitchen amounted to $6, what would be some several $100s today. If we made that every day, we'd be sitting high, but I already suspected that the outdoor kitchen was a temporary fix. Already folks were looking to rebuild their shacks and houses, and everyone was short on cash. The money Tan made might be enough to replenish our stores of beans and flour and sugar, if we could get it, to repair the holes in the house, but not enough to buy a horse or to see us through summer. It wouldn't be enough should Rose turn up injured, or worse and unfathomable if we never found her. But how could I live with a thief I couldn't trust? And what would I do if Tan were to go away? I was only a girl, so tired. I undressed, hung my soot-filled clothes over the banister in the hall, and put on my one nightgown. I curled in a ball on my cot and tried to quiet my mind. I stared into the dark room for hours. At last, the word I fixed on was fairness. I didn't know exactly what it meant, having seen precious little of it in the world, but it came to me that maybe it was the opposite of one of the things my mother Rose had told me. Show the devil, the devil, and he'll say howdy-do. Just before dawn, I ran downstairs, rapped on the basement door, and waited till I heard Tan's slow creep, the swish of his silk slippers as he climbed the raw wood stairs. He opened the door tentatively, and oh, what a sad sight he was, hair hanging to his waist, unbraided and stringy, his sleeping garb ripped. He looked as if he were about to face the executioner. Look, I said, speaking quickly before I lost my nerve. I'm not anyone's police. That's the first thing. Second, I'm bound to make the repairs, buy supplies, and there's no telling for how many months we'll have to feed ourselves. There's no telling how long we'll go without running water or heat, or if Rose will show up. I gasped, having forgotten to breathe. Pulling the blanket I'd thrown over my shoulders tighter, I pushed on. So here's the deal. For now, we run the kitchen and anything else we think of to make cash, and off the top, we set aside 75 cents for every dollar for expenses. Anything left, we split 50-50. I may choose to throw my share back into the kitty, but you do what you want with yours. 10, 50-50, fair square. I paused so he'd feel it. I paused to catch up with the idea myself. Thing is, I didn't know what I would propose till the words spilled from my mouth. I wasn't sure if what I said was right, but having offered the deal, I'd stick with it. Watching Tan's expression, I knew at least I'd hit the target. He was shocked. Between us, we had 100 reasons to distrust, even hate each other. Yet with everything turned on its side, the hate between Tan and me made us more alike than not. The hate between us was kind of a respect too. Partners, he declared, puffing his bony chest with pride. He jutted his chin and dared me to take it back. I offered my hand. When I noticed it was clammy, I wiped it on my blanket and offered it again. How was it possible that Tan's hand was smaller than mine? The skin on his palm was as cracked and dry as the shell of a crab. Good, he said. Good, I echoed, then added, a couple more things. The ideas came quickly now. Tan, you can't call me girl. I won't have it, and it doesn't do you any good, not with these fancy neighbors. They'll judge you, and it won't be good. From now on, you have to call me Vera. Let me hear you say it. V, he said. No, damn you, only Pi gets to call me V. Missy V, he offered. I thought about it for a second and decided that was good enough. All right, next, I said. We have to find her, Tan. We can't wait for the fire. We have to find her. Tomorrow, you and I will head downtown to find Rose. Nah, he shook his head. What, I spat, you don't care about finding her? He stared at me oddly. I can only describe his expression in terms of what it wasn't, not the usual grimace or anger or disgust. Tan looked, well, he looked sad, his hands curled into empty cups at his side. It was a gesture so unlike him it stopped me. He waited till I understood. He couldn't go with me. It wasn't safe for him to be anywhere outside the protection of Rose's house, and certainly not by the piers, where they'd consider him an escapee and lock him in the Chinese encampment. The fact that he wasn't able to go with me shamed Tan, and it shamed me too. I found myself apologizing for the unfair state of things. It's all right, I said. We'll figure another way. I meant it, though I suppose I sagged a bit at the prospect of having to go alone. We said our goodnights with a simple nod. As I walked away, I looked back to find him watching me. Tan, do you think the fire will? Sleep now, Missy V, he said. Tan will watch. Okay, I'm gonna stop there.
That was great. I love that line, you know, whatever I was going to do or say next was going to define me forever. I thought that was a really, really powerful line. So let's
go ahead.
I mean, well, let's start talking about, like, I'm so curious because when I was reading your book, I was just so swept up in the historical details. You and I have both been steeped in history in our various ways. So I'm just so curious, like, how you approached A, the research, and then B, turning it into something that doesn't sound like research, which is like the hardest part of when we start appropriating or taking other documents. Like, how do they actually become vivid? And I'm already drinking a Quake cocktail. I warned you. I
forgot my Quake cocktail. I promised you. I'm going to have one right after this.
Okay. But seriously, how did you approach it? So I'm curious.
Well, and I want to pose the same question to you. It's one of my favorite aspects of writing is that Curious George aspect of going way down deep into primary documents. I read a lot of newspapers. I've certainly read a lot of firsthand accounts. They're amazing firsthand accounts of survivors of the quake. But I also looked at a lot of photographs like you. You know, photos are so evocative and they show people in different ways, exposed in different ways that for a storyteller are just, you know, you can make up all kinds of things about folks. But I spent about 2 years researching the book and just coming up with storylines and characters. And then I think it's really important to forget a lot of it.
Yeah, that's
you know, it's those little moments that you find. I'm reading newspapers, those little bits of just sort of side articles, not the main article, that can be so evocative. But how about for you? I mean, that iconic photograph that you started with.
Yeah.
How did you build? Did you start with the poetry? How did you build?
Well, I kind of got lucky, to be honest, because I, like you, as soon as I got the commission, I sat down and I just started reading for for about 2 years. I read pretty much all sorts of things from the 19th century. And I thought, well, what I'll do, because I knew I had to present this poem in a public forum, I thought, well, what I'll do is I'll just make it a cento, which is just like, you know, take from all of these different sources and create a long poem. And that just seemed incredibly insufficient. And it wasn't until I started reading about Angel Island, I realized that was the form, that was the spine that could contain all of the things, because the transcontinental literally changed every aspect of American life and culture. Yeah. And we forget that. It's sort of like, you know, like what the internet is to us, that was a transcontinental to them. So it was this thing that's one of the reasons why I wanted to do a digital poem, to speak technology to technology. But I love what you just said about how you do all this research and then you spend your time forgetting it. And you do try to figure out what is the central story behind a kind of story, so you can preserve not quick takeaways, but something that contains story, because that's the thing that's going to make someone want to keep reading. No one, I mean, people can be dazzled by facts, but they're not going to stay there for them, right? And those photos.
And we're bombarded by facts every day.
Bombarded by facts,
we're
right?
Bombarded by facts, and so where you go in your poetry, and where I hope I go in my fiction, is what is the connective tissue? You know, what? How is it all linked? How is it all? Why does it matter? Why do these moments when essential change happens between people, why is that important? Why does that matter? I mean, what really kicked off looking at 1906 was the preamble to the 2016 election. For
Yes.
and seeing the corruption, but also seeing that our society was really on a precipice. And it made me think, I want to write about that. I want to write, but I don't want to write about that. And so 1906, with all the corruption, and certainly the pivotal moment when all of society collapsed, it sort of gave me that room.
I think that's also what really struck me in reading the 19th century toward the 20th century, like the transcontinental period, was that it maps so perfectly onto our own matters, our own moment in time. So I have a poem in there about presidential impeachment. It's just a contrapunto where I take all of the speeches of Andrew Johnson and I put them basically so they mirror the speeches of Trump. And there's a disturbing one-to-one correspondence between their racist rhetoric, their ways of imagining nation building, their ways of thinking about the power of the presidency itself. And when you think around that same period of time, you locate the earthquake is this place where you see the rampant corruption among politicians, societal change, and that whole time period, you've got massive social unrest, you've got cholera epidemics, you've got race kind of war at that point, race wars, because you've got lynchings, you've got a massive sort of anti-Asian policy that starts to shift into the culture because of Chinese immigration and the fears of Asian infiltration. It just maps too perfectly in some respects onto now, but there's also some really salient and important differences. And I found myself thinking, just like you said, maybe the best way to write about now is actually to write about the past.
Well, because all that has evolved, all our technology. I mean, the one thing that hasn't been retooled is human nature.
Exactly.
And the quake happened. All of San Francisco was on fire, and immediately some of the leading fathers of the time started to figure out a way to move the Chinese permanently to Bayview and take that real estate in Chinatown, which was prime real estate. And I mean, it just the bodies weren't even collected and people were maneuvering. And the only reason they didn't get to pull it off was Shanghai weighed in heavily and kept them from doing that. But I mean, just as I was researching, I mean, it was incredible. The prejudice of that time and how little things have changed. I mean, we think things have evolved so much, but the echoes are not as, they're not as shockingly abstract as we like to think.
It's funny because as I'm turning the digital project into a book, there's two photographs that basically organize the book. The one is that A.J. Russell photograph, and the other one is a picture of Robert Smithson's The Spiral Jetty, which was built right next to the Golden Spike Memorial, which is where at Promontory Summit, where the East and West railroads met. And if you look at them visually, they make an argument. A.J. Russell's is this X, which is sort of like X marks the spot. It's all about progress. It's all about completion. And Smithson's is all about decomposition, entropy, and spirals. And so for me, it feels like there's a real tension in history. And I feel like we keep asking this question, whether it's a 1619 project or anything. Are we progressing as Americans, or are we devolving as Americans? Are we an X, or are we a spiral? And one of the things I really liked about Vera is that is a question that sort of animates it. I mean, here's the jewel of the West that dissolves in a minute. And do they go forward? And in what ways do they go forward?
Right.
And in what ways do they kind of collapse again? It's really a fascinating book in that way.
And thank you. And how we keep repeating cycles. And who are the outliers? It's often those who are most marginalized who have the creative juice to at least push society forward, or in moments find recalibration, but we are destined to repeat, aren't we?
And on that dark note, should we take questions in the last 5 minutes? Are there any questions from the audience? I don't know.
Yeah. Hi, everybody.
Oh, someone's already writing in drink
ideas.
Yeah. Please talk about the hybrid and its challenges. Whoa,
Yeah.
okay. So you just asked me a question about a dissertation in the last 5 minutes. All right, really quickly. So, and I'd like to hear your thoughts about this too, because of course, narrative is it's a digital format. So the hybrid, depending on where you go and what hybrid means, I think people tend to mean almost everything with hybrid. And so for me, I've always had to define what hybrid means project to project. And so for me, like thinking about West, hybridity is to think about how digital and textual are going to work together, as well as visual and sonic and textual. So there are things that I could achieve with an audio poem or a video poem that I couldn't even just with image and text, which is there's a poem about the Civil War, and there's sounds of gunfire that eventually evolve into the sounds of beating iron into the railroad, so that there's an actual one-to-one correlation in the sounds of the railroad and war, to make that argument about war as, the transcontinental is ultimately a Marshall Project. When I'm thinking about turning this into a book, I have to think about what is the reading practice we can have online, and how can I preserve and also change that once it gets to the book. There's one thing that's very similar about the textual book with the internet, which is, you can just sort of select with a book of poetry more so than any other form of literature, because, oh, okay, I want to start in the middle of the book and then wend my way through, and you will potentially lose nothing, whereas you would lose a lot with a novel. But with the textual book, my book divides in half. So I've got the poems, so you can read those, and I've got some images, but then there's an essay. And it's funny because, Carol and I were just talking about, you have to lose everything. I refuse to lose my research. So I turned them into a series of mini lyric essays. Each poem actually comes with a tiny lyric essay attached to it with all the notes. So you can read in any direction you want. You could read only the notes, and they function as one single lyric essay. You could read poem to essay, and they create a different form. You could read just the poems, and they create a different form. So the idea is basically rather like Vera, how do we translate history? And you can translate it over and over and over again. So that to me is what the hybrid means. But I'm curious for you, why was narrative a digital and not a textual product?
Yeah, I just want to say I want to publish some of that stuff. So, I know where you live, sister. So, in my other life, there is narrativemagazine.com for all you folks. I hope you'll check it out. We publish fiction, poetry, essays, and art. And there are thousands of these amazing works of art in the narrative library, and all of it's free. So when we started it in 2003, really the web was in its early days. I like to say the tumbleweed days of the web. The New York Times wasn't online, the New Yorker wasn't online. And it seemed to us that if writers didn't get on the digital train, they were going to be increasingly marginalized. So the idea was to advance both reading and writing. So on the writing side, to bring forward new and emerging talent and publish them alongside the greats, and to pay everyone, which was really revolutionary for digital stuff.
Yeah.
But on the reading side, to make it all free, so that people in under-resourced communities could have access to literature. And what's happened, 18 years later, there's a global readership, and increasingly schools all over the world are teaching from narrative. and using the library as the basis of literature classes from middle school through university. So in Seoul, we just ran a high school writing contest, and we heard from 23 countries, from Poland to Malaysia to little villages in India. You know, how do these people find us? We're a little nonprofit. But that's the idea. And what I love what you're saying is, you know, there was this sort of prejudice in 2003 that it was either print or it didn't matter. But where I've always sat, and why the work you're doing is so important, is it doesn't matter how someone finds their way in. We want them to find their way in, right? We want them to come to stories. So if they open in the middle of what you're doing and read the essay to get to the poem, or look at the image to get to the poetry, to get to the, you know, to give as many ways in generosity is I think amazing. So I love what you're doing. I want to know where is the project going to end?
When I die, I mean, I have nine more.
What I mean by that is what's the goal? Like, what's the vision on the horizon?
So I think about this. I mean, obviously, I've got 9 more videos to go before the digital project is completed. The textual project is going to be published in 2023. So in that sense, it will be done. But I want to go back to the question briefly about what are the challenges, especially around a digital hybrid project, which is that what is it has exposed for me is in some ways a digital literacy divide, which has always been there and is in some ways gotten very stark in some ways, not just generationally, but around certain communities. Like there are certain people that play on the internet, and there are certain people that are not trained to play on the internet. And so for me, I think that question of like, what do I want to do with Wes is I want us to try to get into communities and show them how to access it so this could be read, this could be seen by more people. And also knowing what happens to a lot of digital projects. Like one of the best things I've ever seen is 88 Constellations for Wittgenstein. And you can't watch it, you can't play it, you can't go on to it anymore because Adobe Flash is done. And so, you know, and Shelley Jackson's, you know, fabulous, you know, different collections of stories, but then also her novels, some of them that are digital, they were so specifically coded that when the code ceases to become relevant, they cease to be able to be read. And I think people forget about this. Like they think that, oh, well, you know, like, you know, this from narrative, I run through websites. You're constantly updating, you're constantly fixing these things. These things are they're like physical bodies. They are in that sense, like the railroad. As soon as you built it, you have to rebuild it.
Alas.
Yeah. And it's really expensive. It's really expensive. Yeah. So, you know, it's funny, we're in this vogue where it's sort of like make everyone do hybrid work, but you know, the real challenge is the expense and the money, the publishing of it, the everything from copyright to coding to upkeep and stuff like that can get wearying. Like the one great thing about a book is you publish it and it's done. And there's no going back in, there's no fixing it, there's no having an ongoing relationship with it.
Alas.
Exactly. But you have a website and it's like a bar, it's like you're married to it. You're like, oh, here's my, you know, annoying sandwich eating spouse. Anyway, yeah. Are we done?
I think I was going to ask another, but I think Jennifer, you
can ask another question if we have time, if you would like to ask one more question.
So what are you working on? You said 2 books. So what's the second book?
So I am writing a book about how to teach and talk about poetry for high school, but mostly college and on sort of students. And I'm really excited about this because I feel like I get to spend time just sort of talking about like what works when we talk about poems, what you know, what exercises work and all that sort of stuff. So what are you working on?
I've started a new novel, and I've got some shorter pieces that have been kicking around for far too long. and an essay about the words we use that is really kind of, think this is an important moment to look at that and to rebuild on the level of words. And also a piece, yeah, I'll just stop there. But a new book is banging at the door. Given my track record of taking many years, I'm hoping it bangs loudly and quickly. It comes in. We'll see. Someone asked in the questions, is this a memoir? It's not a memoir, it's a novel. But I should have said that the narrator of the book is the much older Vera. In fact, she's over 100 years old. She's the oldest survivor of the quake.
Yeah.
So I wanted to answer that before we got out of here.
Yeah. And let me just make a plug for it too. It's such a page turner. I really just enjoyed, it's funny because I never thought reading a novel about mass disaster would be a fun time at this moment, but it really is. It's a page turner. I found it heartbreaking at the end. I will not surprise anybody around the end, but and I also thought that the character's name Vera is very good. She's always in pursuit of the truth, and I really appreciated that about that. So
thank you. And I want to similarly, I have plugged this book of Paisley's everywhere I've gone. If you wonder about this question of appropriation, and no one seems to understand it, but Paisley does, and it's this is a must read. I just think everyone needs to read this book and sort of think about the world in a different way. So I'm so grateful.
It's true, and it's one of the most important discussions that we have in workshops.
Yeah.
And it really is an important book for a lot of reasons, but including that. And I love the blurb that says, as a writer, I've spent 2 decades waiting for a book like this. And as a teacher of writing, I will spend the next 2 decades recommending it. So
absolutely.
If you don't have these books, please order them. There's information in the chat on how to order them from bookshop.org. I'm sure any of your local libraries and bookstores will have them. Don't forget to tell people about your wonderful experience here listening to these amazing writers tonight. And when it's on YouTube, we will send it to all of you as well. If you missed the beginning, please rewatch. And thank you so much for being here. It was truly incredible. And I love the fact that you had a conversation with each other and how well your work spoke to each other. So thank you so much, Paisley, for jumping to say, I want to read with Carol, and for setting this up. We're really happy to have the two of you here tonight. And again, if either of you have time in your very busy schedules to teach a one-day class for us on Zoom for the Hudson Valley Writers Center, we would really love that. So reach out to me at any time. And thank you all for being here.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming. All right, I enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Have your Quake cocktail.
I'm about to do it. All right.
And we'll save the chat and we'll send it to you, Carol and Paisley, so you can see what everyone has written tonight if you haven't had a chance to read it all. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. Okay, Paisley. Bye.
Both of you. Bye. Thank you so much.